From Los Alamos National Laboratory, this is the National Security Science Podcast.
One of the questions that I always get is, why here? If you guys do a quick 360, there is absolutely nothing. That made this place a great place to set up a scientific test.
Hello, and welcome to the National Security Science Podcast, a spin-off of National Security Science magazine at Los Alamos National Laboratory in beautiful northern New Mexico. I'm your host, Brenda Fleming. The National Security Science magazine team recently traveled south from Los Alamos to the Trinity Site, where the first nuclear device, called the Gadget, was detonated almost exactly 80 years ago, on July 16, 1945. The test was performed largely by members of Project Y, the Los Alamos branch of the Manhattan Project, to confirm whether their implosion-type atomic bomb would work. In an implosion weapon, a core of plutonium is compressed by high explosives, which creates a nuclear reaction. At the time, scientists weren't quite sure if this design for the implosion device would work as intended, so they picked a remote location in southern New Mexico to test it. Along with our National Security Science magazine team, dozens of other laboratory employees visited the site located on the White Sands Missile Range, a few hours south of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Before we dive into this visit, I should mention that we also visited the Trinity Site in 2021 and did a podcast at that trip as well. The podcast, titled The Trinity Test Then and Now, describes the test differently than what we'll talk about today, so I encourage you to check that out. To talk through our recent visit, which included stops at the Schmidt-McDonald Ranch House, Jumbo, and Ground Zero, I have National Security Science writer Ian Laird with me today. Ian, had you ever been to the Trinity Site before?
I had not. This was my first time.
So what were your initial thoughts when you first arrived?
It was hard to not get lost in the vastness and emptiness of the basin where the test took place, which is maybe not surprising given the name of the desert within the basin is Jornada del Muerto, a phrase that roughly translates to Journey of the Dead. I wasn't alone in that thought, as many people from our tour group also noted the harsh environment that, in the 1940s, would have been dotted with isolated ranch houses.
They didn't call it the Journey of Death for nothing.
Right, exactly.
This was a rough spot.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it was. Yeah. A lot of different layers of history, for sure.
There are indeed.
Mm-hmm. Although, how do you, have a ranch here? There's no water, there's no grass.
No, I would definitely take the government.
I mean, I do like the house.
Our tour guide, White Sands Missile Range Museum specialist, Jen Jett, and Nicholas Lewis, a lab historian, also commented on the desolate environment.
One of the questions that I always get is, why here? If you guys do a quick 360, there is absolutely nothing. That made this place a great place to set up a scientific test. Manhattan Project, they were looking for a couple of key characteristics of where they were going to have the Trinity test. It had to be away from populations, check. It had to be relatively close to a railroad siding, which is the railroad siding at New Mexico, 40 miles to the west. And then it had to have flat terrain, also check. The flat terrain was because this is a scientific test. They wanted everything to be as controlled as possible. Varying topology, ruins, blast wave propagation, other science stuff that happens.
In July, it would have, except for the thunderstorms, it would have been dry. It was burning hot. Everyone was building little temporary lean-tos to try to find some shade.
Oh, to get out of the sun.
Here and there while they were working 10 to sometimes 18-hour days. It definitely provided a unique experience that they hadn't experienced on their university campuses. That's for sure. This one, the reasons why Oppenheimer chose it, because he loved it so much.
Our first stop was the Schmidt-McDonald Ranch House, which is where the plutonium core of the gadget was assembled. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but first, Ian, can you give us some context and history of the house?
So, the Schmidt-McDonald Ranch House gets its name from Franz Schmidt, who initially built the house in 1913, and the McDonald family, who purchased the house from Schmidt in the 1930s and used it to raise animals. It's a pretty isolated home with rustic and weather-worn adobe facades. It has 4 main rooms, a one-room addition on the north side, and a front porch. It's surrounded by a low stone wall, and beyond the stone wall, there are corrals for animals, remnants of a bunkhouse and a barn, and a windmill water pump that fed 2 water storage tanks.
And what condition is the house in now? Is it the same original structure?
Some of the stone and adobe is original, but a lot of elements of the house, including all of the wood, has been replaced. For nearly 40 years after Trinity, the structure went untouched and unrepaired. But in 1984, a restoration project to return the house to its 1945 appearance began. With that project, the house now embodies the charm and feel that it likely had decades ago. The floors are creaky, the walls look both haphazard and sturdy, and the rooms felt like they bordered between cozy and claustrophobic, although that might have been because we were with so many people. Looking out beyond the structures, though, it's just desert as far as you can see. A sentiment that was voiced by many attendees was just how unlikely a place it seemed for ranching.
Seems like a very difficult place to have a ranch.
Yeah, I was thinking that for a minute. It's like, how would you ranch here?
Yeah, like how do you grow anything here? What did they have cattle? What did they ranch? It seems like such a desolate place to have a ranch.
I know, it's they actually still ranch out here. There's probably a good 1,000 head of cattle within 25, not within 25 miles, but from here to the northern extension area.
They must be hungry.
Oh, they make it work. Before the 90s, there were herds of feral horses, like thousands of feral horses out here. And so, I don't know, I guess they just adapted. They also had, like, specifically set up wells.
Yeah, I was going to say, what did they drink?
Being in a desert, water was extremely valuable, but not all of it would have been safe to drink. Here's Jen to explain.
The water table is actually pretty shallow. It starts less than 1 foot below our feet right now. Unfortunately, though, most of the water in the alluvial plains for the Escuras, which is these guys over here, and the San Andreas, which is those guys over there, are so heavily gypsum charged that the water is completely alkaline and undrinkable. If you try and drink it, you'll probably throw up. I haven't tried it, and I don't recommend it either. However, when the test personnel were out here, it's July 10th through the 13th. It's really hot. Like, it's even worse, but it's like this exact amount of sun. And it's super hot, so once they're done assembling the cores of the bomb and doing all the other prep work, they head on over to the 2 tanks over there, and they hop in for a swim. That's pretty great. It feels fantastic. They hop out, and then they immediately started turning red and shedding. So imagine putting that in your system. No bueno.
It really is hard to grasp just how harsh the environment is until you are there and thinking about what it might be like to live there for a day or a week or even a year.
Yeah, I can't imagine what it would have been like to work there, sun up to sundown, in preparation for the test. How long was the house used by the scientists?
So, the house was initially acquired by the government in 1942 when it established the Alamogordo bombing and gunnery range in the surrounding area to train bomber crews for World War II. The house sat unoccupied for a few years after that, until early 1945, when it was identified as the closest structure to the site selected for the Trinity test.
And it played a pretty big role in the lead up to the test. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so the ranch house is where they ended up assembling the plutonium core of the implosion device that was used for Trinity, and because of that, at the time, there had been writing on the front door that said, "Please use other doors, keep this room clean." The writing faded in the following years, but White Sands Missile Range Museum folks had reinscribed it on the door as part of their maintenance efforts. Walking through that door, the first room we entered on the right was the device assembly room. Inside the house today, there are hundreds of photos and dozens of posters, signs, and newspaper clippings that all offer a glimpse into the history of the building. The photos, I thought, were particularly interesting because they showed just how young so many of the employees were. In a lot of cases, you were looking at essentially kids, fresh out of college or still in graduate school preparing for the test. I also think it's worth reflecting on how much they might have known about what it was they were assisting with. I think there's an idea that the Manhattan Project was an insular operation where the secrecy was meant to hide information from those on the outside of the project. But there were also barriers between the different groups and teams involved in the project to try and limit the amount of people who knew everything. A proliferation of information was seen as a possible detriment, and in relation to Trinity, there's a somewhat wild anecdote that really kind of drives that point home. Here's Nick Lewis, the lab historian, again.
And Oppenheimer said there were too many people on site who knew too much about how the gadget worked. He was afraid of sabotage. So he wanted someone to stay with the gadget the entire night until they're ready for the test. And Donald Hornig is a very young physicist. He was only 22, 23 at the time. He just earned his PhD. He had designed the firing system for connecting the detonators. Well, he was volunteered because he was the youngest. He said he didn't know if that was because it meant he was most likely to be able to scramble up a 100-foot tower, or it meant he was the most expendable. But he was chosen to ride out the thunderstorms in the shot cabin, sitting next to the bomb while it was armed and ready.
So lightning could have struck it and set it off.
Yeah, well, he probably wouldn't have known about it, but it very well could have changed the evening. But he sat there until about 5 o'clock in the morning. It's exactly when the project meteorologist said the storms would end, and they could probably do the test around 5:30.
Yeah, I remember everyone hearing that story from Nick and being shocked by it.
Yeah, it's definitely something that you could never imagine happening now, but that was somewhat a product of the time pressures the project was faced with. I think you look at a story like that and it gives you a real sense of the, not necessarily freedom, but acceptance of risk that the team took on in the way operations were conducted at the site. The scientists had been directed to confirm the viability of the implosion device before the Potsdam conference, so that Truman could inform Stalin about the weapon. They were on a tight deadline, and expediency was of major import.
There were more than scientific pressures, and their whole direction was try to make the test happen on time.
So is it push it through?
Push it through, yeah. And so they decided what were the 3 main criterion for selecting the diagnostics. So critical, nice to have, unnecessary. And they lumped into one of those 3 categories. Things like yield, those absolutely need to know, and essential. The test has to happen, and all the logistics, the essential planning. It was a daily progress update. What had to happen to make it successful? The fact that they are planning and building this test site while they still haven't secured the molds for producing the explosive lenses, they're having trouble getting those. The material coming out of Hanford, there are delays with that. Getting the high explosives to hold together in the right way, that's difficult. They have to find the best lenses that come out of the molds, and all this is happening while they're preparing to do the test, and they don't have all the pieces to build the thing yet.
Just a lesson in persistence, though.
Oh yeah, it was just one of the most intense R&D experiments ever conducted, just because they, as of January 44, it was first proposed as, let's do a test. And then by the middle of 45, they had done it.
Yeah, it was very intense in a way that, like you said, is hard to describe.
One last thing real quick before we move on from the ranch house.
Sure, go ahead.
After the test, the house was part of an interesting confrontation that, up until our tour, I'd never heard of.
After the tests, the ranch house was completely fine. Well, it was mostly fine, no structural damage whatsoever, which is crazy considering we're like 2.5 miles from ground zero. But the decades after the war were not nearly as kind to the ranch house. The McDonalds had been promised when they were kicked off their land, when this became the Alamogordo Bombing and Gunnery Range. They were promised after the war, they could come back. They can't really say anything, it's your patriotic duty to give stuff. It was a different mindset back then. But the similar mindset was when the government came in and said, actually, we're turning this into White Sands Proving Ground and you can't go back. So they came back. The McDonald's came back and they had guns. There was a nice standoff Waco style, but not a Waco style result. Eventually they were convinced to vacate all of the land, and they were adequately compensated in accordance with federal law.
That's very Wild West sounding.
Yeah, and that pretty much wraps up everything of note from our time at the ranch house.
From there, we drove the roughly 2 miles toward Ground Zero. Before we saw the actual Ground Zero, we saw Jumbo.
That's right. Jen stopped us before the big cylindrical hunk of metal known as Jumbo.
And you were somewhat familiar with Jumbo, even though this was your first time touring Trinity, right?
Yeah, Joe Gibson, another national security science writer, had written a story about Jumbo and other containment vessels for the New Mexico issue of National Security Science magazine. So I had some understanding of its design and purpose. Jen explained it to our group too, though.
All right, everyone. Welcome to the entrance to Ground Zero. Behold, tiny. I'm just kidding. It's not even that tiny. This is Jumbo. This is a lot more fitting name. Jumbo was a giant metal container, and it's pretty thick, 6 to 9 inches. Jumbo was originally made in Sandusky, Ohio. Babcock & Wilcox was the company that eventually took the contract after a bunch of other big-name foundries passed on it.
The idea behind Jumbo was those thick metal walls would help salvage valuable plutonium in case anything went wrong with the test.
And so we have the plutonium implosion type. The problem with the plutonium implosion type is that you have to get everything completely symmetrical. If one side goes off before or after the other, it kind of just blows out one on the end, and then the vaporized plutonium, I think that was about half the available supply of plutonium at that time, would just be scattered in the Mexican desert, never to be seen again. And then Groves would, of course, had to stand before the Congressional Committee on Spending and, justify why he just scattered $1 billion worth of plutonium out into the wind.
So Jumbo was the safeguard in case the device fizzled and failed to produce a full nuclear explosion. In that scenario, Jumbo should have been able to completely contain the explosion, allowing scientists to clean it out and salvage the valuable plutonium inside. In the case of a full yield detonation, though, Jumbo would be vaporized. But in that scenario, the test would be considered a success and there wouldn't be a need to recover the plutonium to test a new configuration.
But Jumbo wasn't actually used for the Trinity test, was it?
No, it wasn't. Ultimately, the scientists had enough confidence in their design and had determined that they had enough plutonium that there wasn't a pressing need to salvage the plutonium used in the Trinity test.
Our group was able to walk in and around Jumbo, which helped us appreciate how gigantic Jumbo is. We even took a team photo in which 5 of us are pretty comfortably standing inside Jumbo, widthwise.
Yeah, Jumbo is massive. It is 10 feet in diameter and it weighed around 200 tons. Enough that when it was shipped to New Mexico from the steel plant it was manufactured in Ohio, it couldn't cross any railway bridges because they weren't rated for its weight load at the time.
They had to do a very circuitous route across the Midwest, South U.S. It would have been tough. They had to do special pathfinding.
Yeah.
So what ended up happening with Jumbo?
Having spent quite a bit of money to commission its construction, Manhattan Project leaders decided they should at least make some use of it. So they put together a different test.
The first lieutenant, one of their school executives down here, and he got he found a couple bombs that weren't serviceable. So he chucked them inside a jumbo and then set them off. That's why jumbo looks like a used it.
Without Jumbo, Trinity was detonated uncontained, which brings us to the final stop on the tour, Ground Zero.
What does Ground Zero of Trinity look like?
It's pretty nondescript. Beyond a few signs that speak to the significance of the location, there isn't a ton that would distinguish the site from the miles of terrain surrounding it. The actual Ground Zero is located behind a fence just past Jumbo. At the center is an obelisk made of dark igneous stone, marking where the Trinity test tower stood. The only hints in the natural landscape that Trinity occurred are a slight depression leading into the obelisk from all sides and a smattering of trinitite on the ground. Trinitite was a material that was formed when the sand and material around the test site was vaporized in the test's mushroom cloud and then returned back to Earth in clumps of glass-like rain.
This is my little box of trinitite. You guys will notice that trinitite is very light. It is a seafoam green color, which is just, it comes from the very unique makeup of the sand. So you can use trinitite or any kind of fulgurite or atomic glass forensically. So you can figure out, well, if you have a reference, you can figure out exactly where trinitite comes from.
There are a few different types of trinitite at the site with different physical features that offer hints as to what was happening in the fireball in the seconds after the gadget's detonation. One type are trinitite pearls, which Jen was collecting to help with some research projects.
Trinitite pearls are exactly what they say. I know you guys can't see this, but it'll be in the box that you're welcome to look through. Trinitite pearls are how we know that trinitite was made through precipitation. Stuff gets sucked up into the fireball. It's vaporized. It starts to condense, kind of like going up and down, like hail does in a storm cloud. It's collecting all this little, all the liquid stuff. Eventually, it gets too heavy, too massive, and then it just falls out of the sky. And then it splats on the ground. That's why one side is smooth, one side is rough. The rough side adheres to the ground. The smooth side, because it's a fluid, it started to spread out, making that nice glassy sheen. However, the trinitite pearls are exactly like hail. Most of them are not this nice, perfectly glassy. They're usually kind of like more of a dirty snowball than hail.
Jen had also brought a Geiger counter, and some people in our group really geeked out on measuring the radiation coming from the trinitite. Speaking about radiation, it's probably important to note that the site does give off more radiation than normal background radiation, but it is far from a harmful amount. The amount of radiation someone would get from standing next to the obelisk for 1 hour is roughly 1/3 of the dose you would be exposed to on a coast-to-coast flight in the US. Because of how it was formed, the trinitite around the site is generally a bit hotter than other materials as well, but Jen estimated that a person would have to roughly eat their own body weight in trinitite for it to significantly impact their health.
At that point, there would probably be other health concerns you'd be worried about. Before we wrap, do you have any other remaining thoughts?
Yeah, there's one thing that one attendee said that I've thought about a decent amount since hearing it.
You can't kick the dirt into Mexico without hitting history.
That has really stuck with me, and it's a great way of voicing how many big events seem to happen in these unassuming places across the state. There are layers of history everywhere in New Mexico, and there are stories like that of the McDonald family that are adjacent to more recognizable stories, but you don't hear about them unless you really go out looking for them.
I think our entire team probably knows a bit more about Trinity than the average person, but we all came away from the visit having learned something new. That's all we have for today, so thanks again to Jen and White Sands Missile Range for helping organize the tour. Thank you as well to Nick Lewis for accompanying us on the tour and helping to provide some great historical insight on so many things. And lastly, thank you so much for listening to the National Security Science Podcast, and don't forget to check out the National Security Science magazine online to learn more about how better science equals better national security.